So, your thesis research that you mentioned, I mean, can you explain what that is? I mean, is that a paper? Is that a program? What is it?
Yeah, so as a graduate student, it's basically like my big project, and it's part of the requirement for me graduating. So my thesis, the title itself is long, but the condensed version of it is I'm comparing bee communities, so the types of bees and the number of bees that are visiting gardens, so in town areas versus nearby natural areas around Williamstown.
So, is that all bees, or is it all types of bees, bumblebees, honeybees?
Yeah, it's a little bit of everything. So I'm not doing wasps or flies or any other pollinators. I'm just focusing on bees. So that includes honeybees, like managed honeybees, also any bumblebees, carpenter bees, the small solitary bees, the shiny green ones, everything.
So, carpenter bees, even though everybody thinks they're bad, they're actually pollen.
Yeah, they are.
Okay.
They're a little bit, they're maybe not moving around as much pollen compared to a bumblebee, but they do still forage on flowers and eat pollen and collect it.
Um, and we've got you've kind of hooked into Williamstown through our Bee City USA. Was that something that you sought out to find a Bee City, or was it just convenient that we were doing that?
It was a happy accident, but I'm really grateful for it. Yeah, I was talking to my parents actually about doing this project and said I'm thinking about coming back to do it around Williamstown, and they were like, "Oh, there's a Bee City USA committee here." It's like, wait, really? Because I've heard of Bee City USA before, but I had thought of it in terms of big cities like San Francisco.
Right.
Like a lot of larger cities had it, but I didn't know. Like I wasn't expecting Williamstown to have a committee.
We're actually, and we're proud of it, that we're actually the only one in the state.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we have the distinction, I think, in the whole country of being the only city that was the first Tree City USA in the state and the first Bee City. So
Oh,
we've got
interesting.
that's
Yeah.
kind of a neat thing.
Mm-hmm.
So had you not found Bee City, what do you think you would have? Where do you think you would have done this, or how do you think you would have pulled it off?
Yeah, so I was deciding between doing the study here or back in Gunnison, Colorado, which is where my school is. But I think even if Williamstown hadn't had the Bee City USA committee, I probably still would have ended up doing it here. I just would have had one less awesome site. I've been working out of Armstrong Garden, as you know, and it's been pretty incredible, all of the stuff that I've caught there.
So do you think that you say Gunnison, Colorado, bee wise, is there a big difference in bees between here and Colorado? I don't know. Is there a big difference?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Off just thinking like what I know about the two areas, I would say yes. I mean, a big difference is Gunnison, Colorado's high elevation. It's around 8,000 feet, I think. And so because of that, you have more, or it's just there's fewer bees, I would say, compared to this area because it's a colder area. So you have a shorter warm season where you have the bees out, and probably totally different species assemblages, like definitely different bumblebee species that I know of out there, and I'm sure other ones as well.
I think we tend to dwell on honeybees, but and I don't know what your experience is up there that you've been looking into. Have you found other? I mean, there's a lot of native bees.
Mm-hmm.
Have you found any of the other bees up there, or has it just been pretty much bumblebees, honeybees?
Yeah, so in Colorado or here?
Here.
Yeah, so here there are honeybees, right? Because people keep the bees because otherwise honeybees aren't native and so
Right.
wouldn't naturally be found in this area. But around here I'm trying to think, there are three kind of main species of bumblebees specifically that are around here. You have the common eastern bumblebee, which, as the name suggests, is very common. And then you have a two-spotted bumblebee, brown-belted bumblebee. And also there's a black and gold bumblebee that just started coming out. I've only seen a couple of queens so far.
So there are queen bumblebees too.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, so bumblebees are like honeybees. They create colonies compared to most other bee species actually are solitary and they live in the ground by themselves.
Right.
But bumblebees, they have colonies just like a honeybee does, except it's a lot smaller.
Aren't they usually in the ground too, or logs, or?
Yeah, bumblebees will either do like an abandoned rodent's nest or like a tuft of grass. Yeah, so kind of just a little cavity somewhere, but usually, yeah, on the ground. But bumblebee colonies are also smaller than a honeybee. So honeybee, you have tens of thousands of bees. Compared to a bumblebee colony, you've never really had more than like 500. I think the estimates are somewhere like 50 to 500 bees-ish.
Do you know if they're are the bumblebees under stress the way the honeybees are, as far as the pesticides and colony collapse?
Yeah, so similar factors are contributing to like declines in bumblebee populations, like with honeybees. So, for example, pesticides, exactly like you said, or changes in land use, so clearing out areas for land development, that kind of stuff. But there's one species of bumblebee that is federally listed as endangered, which is the rusty patch bumblebee. And I think historically they could be in this area, but they've been seen in other parts of the state. I don't think we have them around here, at least not that anybody has found anytime in recent history. But there are other bumblebee species, for example, like the American bumblebee, which once again, its range, it could be in this area that has seen declines but isn't federally listed as endangered yet. It's interesting with a lot of the bee research that's going on, like we learned a lot about bees and yet there's still so much we don't know.
Right.
For example, people haven't really been doing population counts or estimating how many bees we have until really like the 70s where it started picking up more. And that's even just for the more popular things like bumblebees. And so there's a lot of things where we say we think we're seeing less of these, but we don't have the historical data to know for sure how severe some of the declines have been.
I'm not wrong. A bumblebee is a great pollinator, is it not?
Yeah, they are. And bees, compared to like something like a fly or a beetle, bees are the only pollinators, or butterflies too. Like bees are the only ones that actively collect pollen, and they're doing that mostly to bring back to lay their eggs with, so they have a food provision.
Okay. And they do a lot of vibrating compared to some of the other pollinators, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah,
they
bumblebees.
get cytoblossom and
Bumblebees, and I'm thinking there's a couple of other species that do it as well. It's called buzz pollination is the term that people have given it, where they latch onto it and they vibrate their wings. It's like some crazy physiological, like they detach their wings in a certain way. And that specific type of pollination helps get more pollen out of plants. And so certain crops, like blueberries, actually require and do much better when they have that type of buzz pollination.
I think tomatoes do too, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, tomatoes as well. So something like a honeybee doesn't do that buzz pollination, which is why native pollinators are also important to some of our favorite foods.
So you mentioned, first of all, for anybody who doesn't know, the Armstrong Garden is at the corner of Highland Avenue and 5th Street in Williamstown, next to the Tomlinson Park. And it's undergone a change. It was a Master Gardener project. Now it's a Bee City USA project, and Joyce McDougall, who's overseeing, has just done a tremendous job of, I think, creating a meadow type natural pollinator that you see. Some of that you see at the Wildlife Refuge out the road. I don't know if you've been out there.
Yeah, it's actually one of my sites, their visitor center. Yeah.
So you mentioned capturing the bees. I'm curious. I mean, how do you do that and not get stung?
That's a great question. So well, first of all, when I'm out catching, I look very dorky. I've got my long pants, my field shirt, hat, I have a net, a fanny pack. I mean, it's the full works. But with that net, what I'm doing is most of the time I take my net and physically put it over a plant. And bees, usually when they get startled, they fly up. And so they'll fly up into the net, and then I just kind of section it off, and then I use a vial and put the bee in the vial. Or the other thing I do is sometimes I just catch them directly off the flower.
So what are you doing? What are you doing once you get them in the vial?
Yeah, so it depends on the bee. So any, like a not bumblebee, I put them in the vial and I basically just keep them in a cooler so they don't overheat. And then at the end of my sample time, I release them. And the reason I do that in the first place is so I don't recapture and count the same bee over and over again.
Okay.
But then what I do with the bumblebees is I have a special vial that has netting on the end of it. And so I actually put the bees in that vial and push it up against it so I can mark it with paint and release it.
So marking it lets you know that you've already done it.
Yeah. And the only reason I wouldn't mark those other ones is because some of them are so small I couldn't.
What are you marking?
I use a paint pen,
Okay.
like a fabric marker kind of.
So it doesn't hurt to be or.
Yeah, I use non-toxic paints. So yeah, when you go over to Armstrong, you'll probably notice there are some bees that have white dots of paint on them. Those are the ones that I've caught.
Okay.
Yeah, but most bumblebees, the workers only live. It depends on the species, but 3 weeks-ish.
So they're like a honeybee. People don't realize that workers don't live long in honeybees.
Yeah. So they're only around for a couple weeks, so the paint lasts long enough that I can see them and make sure I don't recapture the same ones.
So, this thesis research that you're doing, what is the program that you're? It sounds like a grad program, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. So what will the degree be in?
It's a Master's of Science in Ecology.
Okay, so what do you plan on doing?
That's a great question.
Yes.
I've been wondering that myself recently.
Yeah.
I know I'm interested in pollinator work. In terms of the exact route I go, I don't have a single path of I need to be working with this organization or this exact job. But I would love to do something with pollinator conservation.
So you got a passion for that?
Yeah. And so I'm still kind of figuring out the details of what exactly, like I said, I don't have a single thing. But that's kind of the general direction that I'm rolling with right now. And it
Sounds like
seems
it's
to
going to be a
right way.
passion for you regardless of whether.
Yeah, I think whether it ends up being a career specifically in pollinator conservation or not, it's definitely something that is close to my heart.
What made you choose this for your thesis?
Yeah, so I got interested in bees in my undergraduate in college. I was on and abroad, and we were in like a cloud forest, and the pollinators in that area was a high altitude, like rainforesty environment, and the pollinators there were hummingbirds. And I was like, wow, that's really cool. I never thought about different pollinators
Right.
in different places. Hummingbirds were the primary ones because it was a really wet environment, so insects didn't do very well. So that kind of piqued my interest, and I ended up going back home after the abroad and reading a bunch of scientific papers, which is how I found bees, because I was like, pollinators are cool, I want to learn more.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, but I'm particularly interested, like in relation to this thesis, in urban pollinator conservation, because I think it's a really interesting kind of realm of, you have the hard science kind of research mixed with public interaction and education and hands-on action in conservation. It's so easy for people, compared to other conservation where it's kind of far away, it's much more attainable for people to go, look, I planted flowers in my garden and now there's bees on it. And a lot of bees, they don't have very big home ranges. It's not super difficult to set up bee habitat compared to other types of species conservation you can be doing. And so it's fun for people to learn about it, and it's fun for me to help people learn about it.
I think for me, the education's been the biggest challenge. It's not my generation or the generation after me. It's if there's going to be a change, it has to start at the elementary level.
Yeah.
I really think that for me to go tell somebody that has a beautiful carpet lawn that sprays chemicals all over it, doesn't want clover and dandelions, I'm probably never going to change that person.
Right.
But yeah, we've been trying to put an emphasis on the younger the better.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if that's a practical approach or not, but I think it's the only one that's going to work.
Yeah, and I think it's amazing how much either misinformation or just lack of information people have about pollinators, especially given, they're kind of accidentally all around us with the gardens that we keep, right?
Right.
And when we add a little bit more intentionality, when we know a little bit more about how to create better habitat, we can make such a big difference so quickly in a small area.
Yeah, we were talking a little before we got started, but one of our big challenges is, and the young kids especially, is the fear.
Yeah.
Fear of getting stung. And I've noticed that this year we have a tremendous amount of little small bumblebees, very small. And I think you could probably pick them up in your hands and they won't sting you.
Yeah, most
they
of
seem
them
real docile. They don't seem like they're young. But I don't know how we overcome that. Do you ever see bumblebees don't produce anything like honey? Am I right?
They kind of do, but it's in a very small amount. It's more of lasting for a few days rather than honeybees, which try to stay over the winter. And so it's not anything that you could collect.
Yeah, the reason I was asking is I don't see people ever keeping bumblebees. Do you?
Yeah, there's actually been a it's growing, but like for growing tomatoes in greenhouses, people have tried commercially keeping bumblebees.
Really?
But the efforts are pretty small scale because they're a lot harder to keep compared to something like a honeybee.
Right.
But also it's been controversial because the species that people were trying to keep for that, or that people still do, is the common eastern bumblebee, which is in the eastern United States. And people were taking this bumblebee species and bringing it to greenhouses in the western United States.
Okay.
And there's still more research going into it, but what I've seen is that it's likely that taking those bumblebees and moving them had spread diseases from the common eastern to closely related other species.
So this isn't like putting a bunch of hives on the back of a truck and going out and pollinate the pecan fields.
Right. Yeah, it was in greenhouses, but the bumblebees could get out of the greenhouses and then accidentally spread parasites and diseases. So I think some of those efforts have been scaled back. But I don't know a lot about it, but that's what I'd heard about it.
I don't, and I don't think it's an exaggeration that if we lose our pollinators, we lose everything.
Yeah, it's amazing how much of our food relies on animal pollination, specifically insect pollination. Especially, I can't remember the exact numbers now, but the nutrients in our diet, so things like fruits and vegetables that have more of the nutrients, not just something like corn that's wind pollinated.
Right.
Those are mostly pollinated by insects, and so if you don't have bees doing your pollination, you don't eat. Yeah. Or you can eat something, but it's probably not going to be a full range of the actual food that you need.
So obviously you've locked into this for your thesis, but I mean, as far as other pollinators, you have plans to get involved with that as far as like butterflies and hummingbirds. And now West Virginia doesn't have any bats that are pollinators, but there are bats that are pollinators.
Yeah. Yeah, I know the most about bees, and that's kind of been my foot in the door into the pollinator world. But I've been saying, I've been out doing all my bee catching, and I see these different butterflies. I'm like, wow, I really don't know much about any of the butterflies around here.
Yeah.
The basic stuff, but I would love to get to work with and learn more about other pollinators as well. I mean, I think hummingbirds are so cool, and butterflies, and there's so much diversity. And once again, there's still so much research to be done. There's so much we don't know.
Well, and people don't realize it here until you start observing their season. Mm-hmm. I mean, it would be rare to see a monarch this time of year, but later in the summer you'll see tons of them. Yeah. Hopefully. So what have you through what stage are you at with your research at Armstrong? Are you near the end? Or are you in the middle or the beginning?
Yeah, so I am collecting bees for the full time that they're active this year. So I started at the very beginning of April, and I expect I'm probably still going to be catching things at least through September, if not through October, depending on how long it stays warm. So maybe give or take a few weeks either direction, but probably into October.
So have you found anything out yet?
Started to.
Drawn any conclusions at all?
Yeah, so my big question was about differences between the natural areas and the gardens, but I've also kind of had some observations throughout the season so far just about patterns or things that I've seen within those different site types. And I've just did a big data entry thing actually the last few days, kind of getting all my data into a statistical program and starting to do the analysis. So I haven't done the formal analysis yet, so I can't say any like final hardline conclusions. But there have definitely been some interesting observations so far. So like for example, in the gardens, early season, so like early spring, what did most people have out? They had daffodils or like the early tulips.
A lot of dandelions.
Yeah, a little bit of dandelion too,
yeah.
But that's actually, I was catching, in the gardens, the bees weren't landing on the daffodils. They weren't really going for the tulips.
Right.
What they were going for were the weeds that were on the margins. So for example, there's like ground ivy, dandelion. The white clover hasn't showed up until later. That was more of a late spring, early summer. And now it's all over the place, of course. Or like Persian speedwell is another plant, like a little, they're spring ephemerals this tall.
Right.
But in the gardens, I mean, for the entirety of the spring, almost every single bee that I caught was off of those weeds, not off of the flowers that people had planted in the early spring because they were tulips, which the bees weren't really going for. And so that was kind of a fun observation I wasn't expecting.
I've always heard that from my beekeeper friends that clover is like the last resort for the bees. They like other things, but if there's nothing else, they head to the clover.
Yeah, and so those kind of weedy plants in the spring actually turned out to be pretty important in the garden in terms of being a food source.
Yeah.
Especially the ground ivy, like Armstrong, because there was a patch of ground ivy that was kind of tucked against the fence. I mean, that's where I was catching the majority.
Was that the purple flowers?
Yeah,
yeah, small purple
ones.
Yeah, I've seen them all over there.
Oh, and red techno, that's the other one. That one's like a
yeah. So how does that compare? You mentioned in the city versus out of the city. Have you?
Yeah, so natural areas, like in the early spring, there's around here it's Virginia Spring Beauty.
Mm-hmm.
The scientific is Claytonia virginica. There's like another Claytonia species out in Colorado that I saw in the spring there as well. But that's a little pink flower, same thing, about this high off the ground. And that was kind of the early food source for pollinators in the natural areas, whereas there wasn't the ground ivy.
Did you look at trees at all?
Mm-mm. Well, if they were in my sites, and most of my sites were in field, and so I didn't have many. I think in Armstrong there was a crab apple that was blooming for a week or two, and that
Well,
was
the
about
reason
it.
I ask is the Bee City here has talked about working with the Tree City
Yeah, get like red
to
buds.
get early pollinating, tulip poplars, um, trees that they would hit,
Yeah.
they got to eat when they come out.
Yeah, I know the eastern red bud trees the bees really like. Although they're early mid-spring
Yeah.
when they're blooming. Yeah. Yeah, but other observations beyond that, definitely different flower communities. So, for example, the gardens have higher floral diversity compared to the natural areas,
Right.
which makes sense, right? Because people are planting a million different kinds of exotic
Sure.
flowers in their yards. But I was noticing, like in the early spring, there were more honeybees in the gardens compared to the natural areas, and that was probably just a function of there was more flowering in the gardens early on compared to the natural areas as well.
So, with all you've learned, if you were going to suggest to somebody how they could help the pollinators, what would be your suggestion? Just somebody who's living in town, I guess.
Yeah, so I think just based on what I've seen so far this season and other knowledge acquired from reading about all this stuff, definitely letting the weeds grow is one of them. I know that's controversial for people because they like everything to be trim and clean, but especially early spring, those first few weeks in April, having those weeds in the gardens looks like it's actually pretty important in terms of having a food source for the bees, unless you're willing to put out flowers that are likely going to get hit by frost.
Now, do you know, and you mentioned spring, and it's really important when they're coming out, but I don't know how late they run, but is it just as important on the backside that they get a good food source for the winter? I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure about like going into the fall because all of those kind of weedy species that I was mentioning that I saw in Armstrong in the early spring, they're all done blooming now. The ground ivy's done, the Persian speedwell, the red dead nettle, it's all gone. Even the dandelions now are less intense.
Well, we've got bee balm and other things that people are planting.
Right, and that's by this point in the summer, anything that somebody has in their garden is going to be blooming. People have things up in June and July.
So it sounds to me like if I were somebody that hadn't done anything, I would probably try to leave as many. I would definitely leave dandelions and clover, which probably makes me the enemy of my neighbors. But that's all right. But I would probably plant pollinator-friendly flowers as much as possible, native pollinators. I think that's important that you not only give the honeybee or the bumblebee, but you're giving the native pollinators the food source that they've had for thousands of years. I guess.
Absolutely. And planting native makes a lot of sense when you think about whatever bees are around here have co-evolved with whatever flowers are naturally around here. And so certain bees, like bumblebees, tend to be a bit more generalistic. They'll go to lots of different things, but there are some bee species that have preferences. They like one genus of flowers, right? They like some kind of mint is their thing.
Okay.
And so having a diversity of flowers that are native helps you have a higher likelihood of getting different bees that like those different types of flowers. And another important consideration as well with that kind of diversity aspect of what you're planting is having flowers that have short tubes. So for example, something like a sunflower that has very short flowers on it. And then you have some of the longer tubes as well. So something like a bee balm that has a longer tube. Because some bees have short tongues.
Trumpet vine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Some bees have short tongues and they can't reach into the long flowers.
I never thought.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? And so having flowers that are like aster family, like something like a sunflower that has little flowers that are available and easy to access for those bees with short tongues, helps you make sure you're getting that. So for example, around here, the brown-belted bumblebee, that bee is native, and I've noticed just even within, for example, in Armstrong, in a single site, they'll go to the milkweeds, which have very small flowers because they can access it, but they won't go to something like a bee balm because the flower's too long for them to access it.
Not going to waste their time.
Yeah, so they can't get into it. They'd rather get what's available. Compared to the Bombus vimaculatus, that's a two-spotted bumblebee. That one has a longer tongue, and so it can forage on a larger range of things.
So, kind of wrapping this thing up, has Williamstown been a good good site for you? I mean, has this worked out?
Yeah, I've been really really happy, especially now that all the bumblebee workers are out. I mean, just the pure number of bees. I was just doing some more data entry stuff today, as I was saying, and I've already caught almost. I mean, I've probably hit at least 900 bees by now that I've caught. In the period of a couple of months, and that's only 15 to 30 minutes of sampling time that I'm doing that. And so just the sheer number of bees in sites where I have the flowers it's been incredible.
I don't know what, and I'd like to say that Bee City USA is responsible, but I can't take the credit, but for that group. But just a couple of years ago, you would have really struggled to find a bee in the lawn.
Yeah.
And now they're everywhere. I don't know. Maybe I don't know. I don't have an explanation.
Yeah. Well, I think even
But
whether
I'm
it's that
excited with it.
causality
Yeah.
or not, I think the work that you guys are doing is incredible because, like I said, there's so much that people don't know, and it's in reality not super super difficult compared to other types of conservation. To have flowers in your garden, it's something
Right.
that's enjoyable, it's something that looks nice, and it's something that's beneficial. And so having that educational component, I think, is important for people to see and just to be able to enjoy. I don't know. It's a very low pressure kind of conservation. Having flowers in your garden, it sounds nice to me.
Well, we want to thank you because you've added a new level to the Bee City USA, and we love the research. We like the input. You stay in town, we'd love to have you on the committee. I mean, it's a win-win. So anyway, thank you very much. I appreciate your time. And anything you want to add?
Yeah, thank you. I've really enjoyed working with you all too. And it's been great. For my project, I reached out on Facebook and said, hey, does anybody have a yard that you're willing to let me come sample in once a week or twice or once every 2 weeks, And so people being able to open up their space has allowed me to do my research
Awesome.
and get that done. So yeah, I'm just grateful for the opportunity to be here.
Oh, let's hope we make a difference.
Yeah.
Keep the food coming.